I shared with the chairman and with all the members of the committee the one name of the DOGE employee, an unelected bureaucrat, a juvenile bureaucrat from Silicon Valley who worked his way up through Tesla and so on and then ended up in DOGE, cut hundreds of millions of dollars to local police. They defunded the police. DOGE defunded the police.
The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that oversight is a central element of the legislative process, because if we can't research the facts on the ground, we don't know what laws to pass.
And I introduced an amendment in the budget reconciliation process in the Judiciary Committee to restore all of that money. Not a single member, neither a Democrat nor a Republican, spoke against it. And my Republican colleagues did not say a word, but they all voted against it. They voted to uphold that nasty handiwork of DOGE, slashing hundreds of millions of dollars, which we appropriated on a bipartisan basis in the House, in the Senate, signed by the President, programmed by the Department of Justice, and awarded to their communities. My community, your communities, communities across the country, and one young person, a midnight computer hacker from DOGE, Elon Musk's emissary, destroyed all of it. More than 300 grants.
This week's events show how MAGA has turned American justice completely upside down and inside out. Over the last week, we've been talking about a single rogue DOGE employee who unilaterally canceled more than $500 million in Department of Justice grants to local law enforcement and victims' rights organizations and those assisting the victims of rape and sexual assault across the country. That's what right-wing policies do. I would say to my friend, the chair of the full committee, we tried to restore that money. Nobody seemed to know how any of this happened, but our colleagues didn't utter a word against our amendment, and yet they all voted against it. What else happened? Well, a 33-year-old January 6 rioter who assaulted our police officers at the Capitol, and he smashed the glass pane through which Ashley Babbitt climbed before she was fatally shot by a Capitol officer, was arrested again yesterday. This time they got him for burglarizing neighbors' homes. This was a guy who was pardoned by President Trump, now robbing houses in Virginia. This Zachary Alam was serving an 8-year sentence after a jury convicted him of 7 criminal felonies and 3 misdemeanors when President Trump granted him clemency as part of the mass pardon of 1,600 insurrectionists and rioters for the thousands of crimes committed on that day. At sentencing, U.S. District Court Judge Friedrich described the testimony of police who recalled Alam as, quote, by far the loudest, most combative and most violent of the January 6 rioters who attacked the police in the part of the Capitol that these officers were defending. And yesterday, the Trump Department of Justice agreed to pay nearly $5 million to the family of Ashley Babbitt, the rioter who tried to storm the House Speaker's lobby on January 6 after she broke into the Capitol and after the aforementioned Mr. Alam broke that window. The Department of Justice originally took the position that her wrongful death lawsuit brought by her family was wholly without merit, no basis, and that Babbitt's civil rights had never been violated by the police, and that the police officer acted reasonably in defense of members of Congress and in defense of Vice President Pence. A Capitol Police investigation cleared the officer involved, saying his actions at the height of the riot, quote, potentially saved members and staff from serious injury and possible death from a large crowd of rioters who had forced their way into the Capitol, into the House chamber, where members and staff were steps away. In 2023, then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said, I think the police officer did his job. Now, although Trump's new attorney general is set to give $5 million to the rioter's family, Trump has not proposed to give a penny to the more than 140 police officers injured, wounded, hospitalized, disfigured, and or disabled in their violence, and nothing to their families. He's proposed no money payments to the bereaved family of Officer Brian Sicknick, an Army veteran with 2 tours abroad who died at age 42 here on January 7th, 2021, the very next day after being brutalized by rioters. The decision to give millions of dollars to the Babbitt family and nothing to the families of the police officers who defended this Capitol, who defended us, exacerbates the insult of Speaker Johnson's continuing refusal to hang a simple plaque in honor of the officers who defended the Capitol and the Congress and the Vice President. A plaque mandated by law and now more than 2 years overdue on the West Front of the Capitol. The Speaker's stubborn refusal to respect the law is craven submission to the executive branch, to Donald Trump, who wants to pretend that the rampaging mob that he sent to Congress was made up of patriotic heroes and that the people he pardoned were, quote, hostages and, quote, political prisoners. A hostage is someone who's been illegally abducted by a terrorist group like Hamas and held for a financial or political ransom. A political prisoner is someone like Alexei Navalny or Nelson Mandela, who's been imprisoned for ideological reasons, not for violently assaulting the police or engaging in seditious conspiracy or destroying federal property. But the administration's effort to create big news yesterday was Trump's acting U.S. attorney in New Jersey, a blatantly partisan prosecutor who has bragged about working to turn New Jersey red. Well, she announced her intention to indict our colleague, Congresswoman LaMonica McIver, on charges of assaulting, resisting, and obstructing law enforcement based on the now famous May 9th incident outside of Delaney Hall, an ICE detention facility in McIver's district, where she was conducting a scheduled oversight visit with other members of Congress, including our 80-year-old colleague, Bonnie Watson-Coleman, and the mayor of Newark. Well, Delaney Hall is operated by the private prison company GEO, a major Republican donor that gave $1 million to Make America Great Again, Inc., and has faced numerous lawsuits for its treatment of detainees and unsafe conditions. The members had a lawful right to be there and to investigate, and even after ICE initiated a scuffle to arrest the mayor of Newark on public property, the House members were let in to tour the facility to conduct nonviolent oversight, and the tour went smoothly. This indictment is a manifest fraud, clearly designed to distract America this week from the administration's savage and unpopular effort to strip 14 million Americans of their Medicaid and health coverage and 11 million Americans of Head Start, Meals on Wheels, and other nutritional assistance programs like SNAP. Representative McIver was, of course, executing one of the core duties of a member of Congress, oversight, pursuant to her precise statutory right to enter and visit an ICE facility. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that oversight is a central element of the legislative process, because if we can't research the facts on the ground, we don't know what laws to pass. This, for the Department of Justice to charge McIver with assault, is an outrage against the Constitution, which protects members of Congress from civil and criminal prosecution for performance of their core legislative duties. It is also a scandal in light of the DOJ's constant backing of cop-beating insurrectionists, including with the shocking policy that these pardons can even apply to criminal charges wholly unrelated to the events of January 6th, as well as the DOJ's jaw-dropping decision to fire more than a dozen senior criminal prosecutors simply because they had worked on the January 6th case. Yet now we've got colleagues who celebrate January 6 insurrectionists actually calling for prosecution of members of the House for doing their jobs. Representative Buddy Carter called our colleagues rioters. Representative Bishop actually said this was an insurrection. I didn't know that was in his vocabulary, but this was an insurrection, and he said it was a debacle worse than 9/11. No police officers or ICE agents were injured at Delaney Hall. No one died. No one had a heart attack like Officer Fanone did. There were no strokes. There were no broken jaws, no broken necks. Nobody was forced out of police work like Sergeant Gonell was. Yet we've got members of Congress who would gladly jettison the speech and debate clause, which protects all of us in our work, the First Amendment, and the Article I powers of Congress to score a few cheap political points at the expense of their own colleagues. In Trump world, violent insurrectionists and cop-beating extremists are heroes. They're martyrs. They're patriots. Members of Congress performing oversight functions are criminals and insurrectionists. And veteran criminal prosecutors of January 6 felons are fired, so Donald Trump can continue to pander to his private militia of pardoned rioters and insurrectionists and a reserve army of extremists who've proven themselves willing to stand back and stand by. Let me show you what a real assault on police officers looks like. If you'd roll the tape. Mr. Chairman, if this is an oversight hearing on ICE and ICE believes a real assault took place in New Jersey, where are they? Why are they not present today? The star of the show is absent, and that, my friends, is no oversight. I yield back.
This is Police Week, in colloquial terms, Law Enforcement Week. And traditionally, we do two things in Law Enforcement Week. One, we recognize the valor and the sacrifice and the commitment of the police officers who serve our communities, who serve us in Congress, and who serve across the country. And two, we try to think of ways that we actually can assist them in doing their jobs better, so we can make their work more effective and safer, and we can make the police function generally more efficacious for the American people. And unfortunately, with this bill, we're not doing either. And in fact, the majority is really falling down on the job in terms of both of those major objectives. In 2022, on March 15th, we passed H.R. 2471 to post in the Capitol, on the west side of the Capitol, a plaque in honor of the hundreds of police officers who nobly served us on January 6, 2021, when our institution, when our democracy came under attack by Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other violent extremists who stormed the Capitol, drove members of the House of Representatives out of our chamber, drove members of the Senate out of their chamber, and attempted to overthrow a presidential election. Now, the new administration has seen fit to pardon more than 1,500 rioters and violent insurrectionists who attempted to overthrow our constitutional form of government on that day. And they succeeded in bloodying, wounding, injuring, hospitalizing more than 140 police officers on January the 6th. And several officers died in the subsequent weeks, and several people died on that day. Now, we passed a law, not a recommendation, not an idle promise, not a suggestion in a suggestion box. We passed a law to post this plaque in the U.S. Capitol. And yet Speaker Johnson has done absolutely nothing to post this plaque. And I know that some of my colleagues think that they are being most effective when they're doing nothing. This is a Congress that's getting the reputation for being perhaps the greatest do-nothing Congress in the history of the United States. But here's one thing that this Congress can do, which is to post this plaque which reads, "On behalf of a grateful Congress, this plaque honors the extraordinary individuals who bravely protected and defended this symbol of democracy on January 6, 2021. Their heroism will never be forgotten." What an extraordinary irony that is. Their heroism is already being forgotten, or at least there's some people who would like us to forget their heroism. Well, that's on the symbolic front, because everybody wants to pay lip service to the police. Everybody wants to say we honor them. Well, let's really honor them. Let's put up a permanent plaque for future generations of Americans to see that these officers risked their lives for the people in this chamber, for the members of the House and the Senate, for the leadership of the House and the Senate, for the staff who work here, for the reporters who are here. We have many officers who have had to leave the police service because they've been wounded and disfigured permanently by the injuries they suffered at the hands of these people. This is the very least we can do at a time when the President of the United States is saying he wants to create a fund for January 6th. Not a fund for Michael Fanone, who had a heart attack and had to beg for his life. Not a fund for Sergeant Gunnell, who was forced out of the force because of permanent injuries and now is living on a fraction of the salary he had before, trying to support his family. Not a fund for Officer Hodges, who was tortured in the eyes of the world, who got caught in the doorway while the insurrectionists beat him with all of their weapons that they brought that day. No, it's not a fund for them that President Trump is suggesting. He wants a fund for the rioters. He wants a fund for the families of the insurrectionists. And as Sergeant Gunnell said recently, it seems like he believes that the rioters and insurrectionists were the ones defending the Capitol on that day. Let's get this plaque up. We voted for it on an overwhelming bipartisan basis, and I appeal to Speaker Johnson to enforce the law. Even if you don't like it anymore, even if you changed your mind about the plaque, this is the law. Let's get it up there. Now, secondly, we should be talking about how we can actually aid and abet and assist law enforcement officers in their work. And unfortunately, we have not had from the majority a single bill that they're willing to bring to the floor to increase any funding for local law enforcement. On the contrary, the emissaries from DOGE, and here I don't necessarily hold my colleagues accountable for this because they didn't seem to know about it any more than we did, but the functionaries of DOGE slashed more than $500 million that the Department of Justice was giving to local police departments across the country and community safety groups and organizations assisting victims of rape and sexual assault. And as far as we can tell, one person in DOGE, one unelected midnight bureaucrat whose career was made with Elon Musk, who seems to have skipped town now, that guy cut out hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to local law enforcement and community safety groups across America. And I introduced an amendment in the budget reconciliation process in the Judiciary Committee to restore all of that money. Not a single member, neither a Democrat nor a Republican, spoke against it. And my Republican colleagues did not say a word, but they all voted against it. They voted to uphold that nasty handiwork of DOGE, slashing hundreds of millions of dollars, which we appropriated on a bipartisan basis in the House, in the Senate, signed by the President, programmed by the Department of Justice, and awarded to their communities. My community, your communities, communities across the country, and one young person, a midnight computer hacker from DOGE, Elon Musk's emissary, destroyed all of it. More than 300 grants. And now they come forward with a budget for next year that would cut more than $1 billion out of law enforcement. FBI, Department of Justice, ATF, you name it. Our colleagues have different reasons that they advance for this, which I think are pretty refutable. But in the big picture, this bill does nothing for existing police officers right now. It does nothing to enhance public safety. And our friends have completely missed the mark, I think, in terms of what Law Enforcement Week should be all about. I'll reserve.
Let's be clear. Republicans honor local law enforcement. Democrats defund them. 5 years ago this summer, they spent the whole summer doing that. That's all you could hear from Democrats. Got to defund the local police. We've been consistent. We have condemned violence every single time it happened, whether it was January 6th, whether it was the summer of 2020. They haven't. Summer 2020, I still remember the guy standing in front of the burning building on CNN saying, "This is a mostly peaceful protest." They spent the whole summer trying to defund the police, so don't give us the lecture. I want to thank the fine gentleman from Mississippi who served in local law enforcement, who was a sheriff, who knows what it's like to go out there and protect his community, for sponsoring this resolution.
Delighted to hear the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee denounce the assault, the violent assault on Congress, the Capitol, our police officers on January 6, 2021. I wonder if he would work with me to help enforce the law that was signed on March 15, 2022 by President Biden for a plaque to be placed in honor of the police officers who served us so valiantly and so bravely and saved our lives on that day. It was supposed to have been up by March 15th, 2023, and the speaker simply has remained non-committal and indifferent. The plaque is actually completed. It's ready to be put up. We can show it again. It's not as big as this poster, but it's the smallest token of recognition and honor that we should be able to extend to the Capitol officers, many of whom are still with us on the force, for their sacrifice and the sacrifice that their families made based on their work that day defending us. And I wonder if the chairman of the Judiciary Committee would follow through on, I think, his very impressive statement that we all denounce the violence of any kind against officers, including the more than 140 Capitol officers who were wounded, injured, hospitalized, some of them permanently disfigured and maimed on that day, as well as officers around the country. Now, on the point about defunding the police, look who's defunding the police. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and their silent partners in Congress are defunding the police. They just terminated $500 million worth of grants, lost funding from the Department of Justice, providing federal support for local violence reduction by community police, community policing and prosecution, victim services, juvenile justice, child protection, substance abuse and mental health treatment, corrections and reentry, justice systems enhancements, research and evaluation, and other state, county, and local level public police and safety functions. And I brought this to the attention of the Judiciary Committee because, again, this was an operation by DOGE. We've got a federal district court opinion from Northern California saying that DOGE basically has no legal status because it wasn't created by Congress. So it might be a completely renegade operation, an attempt to create a fourth branch of government. In any event, those of us who voted for the money, and that's people on both sides of the aisle, voted for the money to be distributed by the Department of Justice to local grantees, didn't even know about this. And I shared with the chairman and with all the members of the committee the one name of the DOGE employee, an unelected bureaucrat, a juvenile bureaucrat from Silicon Valley who worked his way up through Tesla and so on and then ended up in DOGE, cut hundreds of millions of dollars to local police. They defunded the police. DOGE defunded the police. Donald Trump defunded the police, and I introduced an amendment to try to restore every single grant that they cut off in severing that federal investment in local police. My colleagues uttered not a word in opposition to my amendment, but they all voted against it, simply because they're walking the line with Elon Musk right off the edge of the Constitution, because there's no constitutional grounding for anything that guy's doing, but they walked the line behind Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and they just defunded hundreds of millions of dollars from community law enforcement and public safety. So don't give me that lecture about defunding the police, which our side has never supported, but their side is just colluded in right now in terms of what the Department of Justice did. And that doesn't even get into their attempt to dismantle completely the ATF, shut down critical functions in the Department of Justice that protect us from foreign involvement in our elections to take down the kleptocracy task force and so on. So I don't want any lectures coming in our direction either. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You can try to rewrite history, but it just doesn't work. Let me just read off the Democrat-run cities that did defund the police. And here's the game the Democrats won. All during the summer of 2020, they were saying defund the police. Democrats-run cities all over the country were doing so. And now they say, oh, but we want the federal taxpayers, because crime went up when we defunded the police. We want federal taxpayers to send us money to make up for the cuts we did there, and we spent the money elsewhere. That was the game. If you don't believe me, here's the list. Austin, Texas, $150 million cut. Boston, Massachusetts, $12 million cut. Burlington, Vermont, $1.1 million. Denver, Colorado, $55 million. Eureka, California, $1.2. Hartford, Connecticut, $2 million. Kansas City, Kansas, $42 million. Los Angeles, $150 million. Madison, Wisconsin, $2 million cut. Minneapolis, $8 million. New York City, $1 billion cut that summer. Norman, Oklahoma, $865,000. Oklahoma City, $5.5 million. Philadelphia, $33 million. Portland, Oregon, $16 million. Salt Lake City, $5.3 million. San Francisco, $120 million. Seattle, Washington, $69 million. Washington, D.C., $15 million. And we know about the crime that's happened in this city. And, of course, in the ranking member's home state of Maryland, Baltimore cut their police department $22 million. And now they're saying, oh, make sure the federal money keeps coming. And look, I'm not against some of these grant programs. We'll look at all those. But don't say you didn't cut the defund the police. You did. Everyone knows you did, and you all talked about it, and you cheered it on. You said for the bad guys who harmed the police that summer when you were encouraging cities to cut the police, the bad guys who were you were raising money to bail them out. Your presidential candidate was raising money to bail them out. So you can have all the revisionist history you want. The facts are the facts. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start just by asking my friend from Ohio if whether he's referring to me when he uses the word you, or if he's referring more generally to some other people, because I would categorically deny having done any of those things. I didn't, so perhaps if...
Referring to that party that you belong to, not you personally.
Okay, well, the gentleman refers, and I think he's aware of this because he's an extremely clever debater, he referred exclusively to things that different local governments did or did not do. I don't know what Denver, Colorado did, or Burlington, Vermont, or whatever. I know what the United States Congress does. And we never defunded the police, and we never tried to defund the police. On the other hand, my good friend, I believe, participated in, and if he didn't, I'm happy to stand corrected, but I know a bunch of his colleagues said they wanted to defund the FBI, just like those who want to defund the ATF and shut it down right now. So that's a reality. But in any event, why don't we talk about what Congress can actually do? The president's new budget proposes to cut this. So this is something that my colleague and I could agree on. He wants to cut $1 billion across 40 Department of Justice grant programs which support local police departments to reduce violent crime, hate crime, and crime against women. Would my colleague work with me to oppose that suggestion in the president's budget? They want to cut $646 million from FEMA for violence and terrorism prevention. Why do they want to do that? I have no idea. They want to cut $545 million from the FBI, cutting its workforce by more than 2,000 personnel. That sounds like defunding law enforcement to me. I know they don't seem to be as fond of federal law enforcement as they are of local law enforcement, but do they really want to cut more than $500 million from the FBI to be fighting criminals and terrorists? I mean, I just, for the life of me, I don't understand how they can do that while they swear fealty to law enforcement. It just makes no sense. They want to cut $491 million from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, making our cyber and physical infrastructure far more vulnerable to attack by foreign bad actors like Vladimir Putin and President Xi and Kim Jong-un. I know there's some people in high levels of office who are fond of those people, who write Valentines to Kim Jong-un. But the rest of us would like to be protected from them. We should not be dismantling the cybersecurity infrastructure of America. They want to cut $212 million from the DEA. Now, can you imagine if a Democratic president had proposed any of this? They would be screaming, their hair would be on fire, but Donald Trump proposed it, and they just mumble along like it's no big deal. What about all of these efforts to defund federal law enforcement, like the DOJ, FEMA, FBI? Will our colleagues work with us to restore that money? I'm happy to reserve.